That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
So John, I just want to ask one more follow-up about that, because so I call this "oops, it got past the goalie," right? So and I like, of course, our press never talks about it. They all pretend that everything is a conspiracy theory. I believe that the phrase conspiracy theory was actually concocted after the Kennedy shooting to just call everything that was against the official government position a crazy lunatic thing to believe, et cetera. But okay, so, but I could never square, well, if there was a conspiracy and did they really kill all the people on the planes, and how did they get the Arabs to do the thing that they wanted, blah, blah, blah. And then many years later, in fact, after October 7th, I realized, this is actually potentially easier than I realized. You just find plots, and you probably, in intelligence, and that's why I'm asking you, find plots all the time. And if you want one of them to be successful for political reasons, you go, I just got past the goalie. There's nothing I could do. So is it possible that October 7th was another one of those?
Oh, listen, call me a conspiracy theorist, but I think that's exactly what happened. We know now in retrospect that for 2 weeks before October 7th, Israelis who were living in settlements along the line, the border with Gaza, were reporting back to the Ministry of National Security that something was happening in Gaza. And Itamar Ben-Gvir said, no, nothing is happening in Gaza. The next attack is going to be in the West Bank. And it was Itamar Ben-Gvir who ordered that government, what's the word I want to use? That assets were being used, government assets were being used against possible cells in the West Bank. Well, there was nothing happening in the West Bank.
Right.
And these settlers were saying, look, the Gaza Palestinians are flying kites along the border. They're releasing balloons. They're checking wind speeds. They're chatter on the walkie-talkies. No, you're wrong. It's going to be in the West Bank. So I think, boy, I really like that, slip by the goalie. I think I might steal that, because I think that is exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that it took 6 hours for the IDF to respond, and just fast forwarding to the moment that we're in now, I just can't get over the incredibly weak and pathetic arguments that are being made by individuals who have been corrupted with money from the Israel lobby, essentially arguing that we must merge our militaries. Because the IDF, I mean, how could we give up this opportunity to take advantage of their expertise and their superior operations? They took 6 hours to respond to October 7th.
And then killed the Israelis.
And then killed their own, exactly.
That were in cars trying to evacuate the area. Yeah, one thing that most mainstream outlets don't talk about is that the Israelis are already in the United States training local police departments. We know, for example, that the Israelis are training the Atlanta police, that this area now called Cop City is the site of Israeli police and Israeli IDF training our own police. I don't want the Israelis training American police departments. The Israelis have no respect for human rights or civil liberties. And so, look, this is a country that has bombed 7 of its neighbors in the past year. Is that really the country that we want to throw our lot in with? I would say no.
So John, Pete Hegseth wrote in his book that the IDF should be in American streets. So there's so many Israeli assets inside our government that it's unbelievable. So, okay, which brings me back to Section 219. So you mentioned it earlier, it used to be called Section 224, now it's 219 going into the National Defense Authorization Act. They tried it with no vote before, now there's more of a uprising against it. Of course, as usual, Ro Khanna, Tom Massey leading the charge against it. And as usual, 94% of Congress saying, no, we serve Israel loyally. So tell us about the dangers of merging our technology with Israel's and why this should be completely unacceptable to the American people.
You know what, Cenk? I'll start back from my very first week in the CIA, January of 1990. That first week, you just sit in the auditorium and you get briefing after briefing after briefing from, the director comes and congratulates you. Then you hear from the head of HR and the head of health insurance and the head of life insurance and the director of security. And the director of security gave us a couple of kind of real life day-to-day pointers. Don't ever eat in this steakhouse down the street from the CIA because the KGB thinks we all eat there and every table is taken by KGB, for example. I've never been in there. But another thing he said, and this is dated, it's 1990, but I would venture to say that it's worse today than it was in 1990. He said that there were two official Israeli intelligence representatives in Washington. This was at the Israeli embassy in Washington. It was one person from Mossad and one person from Shin Bet, okay? And they carry out liaison. But the FBI was able to identify 187 Israeli spies spread out all across America, mostly infiltrating American defense contractors to steal our secrets. It didn't end with the arrest of Jonathan Pollard. And he said, Israel is critical threat for counterintelligence, along with Russia, China, Cuba, and North Korea. And I think Iran may have been on the list at the time too. And Israel. And I'll give you another example. When we came up with this ill-advised F-35, the Israelis came to us first and said, we want the F-35. And we said, great, we're gonna give you the F-35. We're gonna slightly degrade the avionics because God forbid one gets shot down and the Russians or the Chinese, get it in Syria or Iran or whatever. So we're gonna call it the F-35I, I for Israel. The Israelis said, no, we want your F-35. We don't want any I with degraded avionics. At the same time, the Emiratis came to us and they said, we want this new F-35. And we said, great, we'll give you the F-35 with slightly degraded avionics because God forbid one should be shot down and the Russians or the Chinese, the Iranians get it. We're gonna call it the F-35E for Emirates. The Emirates gladly took the F-35E. The Israelis sent their spies all over the defense sector to steal the avionics, so that when they finally got the F-35I, they could upgrade them on their own. And that's the country that we want side by side with our people in the Pentagon and the CIA and God forbid NSA or DIA, when the director of DIA is warning every single employee that they are unusually aggressive against us right now, the Israeli Mossad. Yeah. And that people have to be extra careful.
So that brings me back to what we started with, John, which is the CIA still American? Because they don't act like it. And so all this espionage is going on. It's super obvious that it's the Israelis. And it doesn't seem like we're doing a damn thing about it. We're just letting them run wild in this country. And I want to go back to Epstein, because we know that Epstein was part of Iran-Contra. He helped clean out the planes that the CIA was using, and he did that with Lex Wexner and seemingly with Mossad. And now, I'll let you talk about what how much you know about that, right? But also, okay, so the CIA at that moment knows Epstein seems to be with Israeli intelligence because we just did a deal with him. Then they let Epstein rape girls in this country for decades afterwards. So is the CIA working for America or for Israel?
I hate to say this, but the only conclusion that I can draw is that it's working for Israel. When you've got the likes of Mike Pompeo at the CIA, who was one of the foremost Zionists on Capitol Hill, and he's guiding policy. Remember, the CIA is a policy support organization. It's not a policy organization. It's supposed to do what the president tells it to do. But historically, it had pushed back against Israel. And then you get Mike Pompeo in there, who might as well be the head of Mossad for his support of Israel. Everything begins to change. And when you have this constant pressure from Capitol Hill, where practically everybody is taking money from AIPAC, and they're primaried if they don't take money from AIPAC, or if they don't toe the line that AIPAC sets, then you lose that independence, and the next thing you know, you are working for the Israelis.
Oh God! So how do you see this ending? Because we don't live in a sovereign country. Under what you just described, we don't live in a sovereign country, and it fills me with rage, and I imagine it fills a lot of Americans with rage. So how does this come to an end? Because eventually, American citizens are going to have enough of this.
Yeah.
So how do you see this playing out?
In one of two ways, really. On the one hand, I've long been accused of being irrationally optimistic about life. And the optimist in me says, well, certainly our elected leaders will come to their senses eventually. But I've got to be realistic. And I just don't think that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they'll come to their senses because, well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, because if you look at the incremental changes over the last 35 years, every one of those changes has been in support of Israel.
Yep.
Number one. Number two, even though public opinion polls are showing that now a clear majority of Americans believe that our relationship with Israel is too close, believe that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, believe that Israel is the aggressor in all of these recent conflicts, our elected officials still line right up in support of Israel. And you've got people like Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna and a small handful of others, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's now gone, but a small number willing to stand up. That number doesn't really grow. So even if, let's say, 77% of Democrats polled say they support the Palestinian side in this conflict, 90% of elected Democrats support the Israelis. And where does that leave us?
That leaves us in a place where we don't have a democracy. Yeah, we are an occupied country. So, okay, I now have a random question for you that I've been meaning to ask for a long time, so I want to make sure I get it in here. So, Barack Obama did something unacceptable when he bombed Anwar al-Awlaki. He went outside of the judiciary and he said, due process does not have to be judicial process. The executive branch can just decide to execute an American citizen, and they did. But that was already egregious enough. But they say, coincidentally, in a second and completely different bombing, they also killed al-Awlaki's 16-year-old son. And then, coincidentally, in a third bombing, they killed his 8-year-old daughter. So were those coincidences, or I have a theory on this one, and I'm curious what you think, that maybe Anwar al-Awlaki was working with the CIA, but then he flipped on him, and so he knew things that the CIA didn't want out, and so they wanted to cover all their bases on anyone who might have known.
I think that's entirely plausible. I'll tell you, I was one of a very small handful of CIA officers who had actually met Anwar al-Awlaki. I met him when he was the imam of the mosque in Falls Church, Virginia. My Arabic teacher, CIA employee, Arabic teacher, took us there so we could learn some of the vocabulary words associated with Islam. And he gave us a tour of the mosque. He took us to the Arabic language bookstore, and then we went to lunch with him. In 2011, I went to Yemen to do a study. I was the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, working for John Kerry. And I went to Yemen, and my first meeting on that trip was with the legal attaché, the FBI representative in the American embassy. And I made a joke about, what are you doing sitting here in your office? You should be out looking for Anwar al-Awlaki. And he said, we know where Anwar al-Awlaki is within 3 feet, 24 hours a day. And I stupidly said, so why don't you arrest him? Mm-hmm. Well, because there was never any intention of arresting him. The intent was to kill him, to track him, and to kill him. That was a policy decision that was made. But why did we let him go as far as he did? I think you're onto something here. I think he was probably a CIA asset at one time. Remember, he was an American citizen. He was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His father was the Yemeni ambassador to the United States at the time, and then went on to become the Yemeni Minister of Agriculture. And I think that he self-radicalized after a while, and they just decided to take him out at a time and place of their choosing. May I add one other thing, Cenk? You raised something that's very important. It's something I've been yelling about for years. We murdered him without ever charging him with a crime. He had a constitutional right to face his accusers in a court of law and to be judged by a jury of his peers. And we murdered him in cold blood. He had never been charged with a crime. But then a week later, we murdered his 16-year-old son and 16-year-old nephew as they sat at a cafe drinking tea. They were children, and they had never been charged with any crime. And then we murdered his daughter, just for good measure, an 8-year-old, which made Barack Obama a child killer. Of course, he already was a child killer, but made him a child killer again. And nobody really seems to care. What about his rights? Because remember what Eric Holder told Rand Paul, if the president wants to kill you, he's perfectly within his legal rights to kill you, and it doesn't matter if you have never been charged with a crime. If the president of the United States doesn't like your politics, he can make you vapor with a missile.